Hey guys, Greg Benz here with the head-to-head lens shootout, trying to help answer the question, what is the ultimate lens for shooting the Milky Way and night sky? At least for lenses that are compatible with the Nikon D810 or the Nikon system. I couldn't, of course, test the Canon equivalent lenses that are only available in Canon mount, but 3 of the 4 lenses I'm testing here are available for Canon and would perform the same way. So first, I want to quickly thank BrentRentsLenses.com and B&H Photo Video out of New York, both of whom helped loan lenses used in this test. I couldn't have done it without their support, so thank you very much for making this possible. First, I've got the Nikon 14 to 24mm f2.8 lens. It's a lens that I've been shooting the night sky in a variety of conditions for many years. It's a beautiful lens. I absolutely love it. It works incredibly well for shooting the Milky Way. I don't have an absolute need to get another lens, but like any lens, it's not perfect, and it does have a bit of coma or sort of spreading or comet trails almost coming out of stars off axis in this lens. It's generally regarded as a good lens for that, and I'm pleased with its performance, but I'd like to get a little bit better. I'm always trying to push the boundaries of what's possible, and that's what led to this review, is trying to figure out, is there another lens in that sort of wide 14, 15mm range that might have less coma? That'll just give me a little bit sharper stars and an ability to print even larger than I already do. So the other lenses I'll be testing are the new Rokinon SP 14mm f2.8 lens. It's a manual focus, relatively more budget lens, still pricey, but compared to the others is more on the budget ends. Then we've got the Sigma Art 14mm f1.8 lens. It's an autofocus lens, sort of in the middle of this range, if you will, price-wise. And then we have the Zeiss 15mm f2.8 lens, also a manual focus lens, and definitely at the high price point range of these 4 different lenses. Now, first impressions of them, I've been shooting with these other various rental lenses for about a day now, and I can say that I'm thrilled with all of them. And if any of them were just the only lens I had, I think I'd be really happy. I haven't tested them in a variety of conditions yet, but the shooting I have done so far, I've been very happy with the general quality, especially just the build quality. The feel of these lenses is very good, including the Rokinon SP, which is sort of a newer premium version for Rokinon. I've never shot with their older budget lens, which is highly regarded for Milky Way, but I can say that all these lenses have very smooth manual focusing. The autofocus on both the Nikon and the Sigma works extremely well. I feel very good about these. In terms of durability, they all feel very robust. I couldn't tell you how they compare in terms of sealing. They all make slightly different claims, but of course, I'm not dunking them in heavy rain to figure this out or putting them into heavy dust storms. But I can say I generally feel very comfortable with all these lenses. And when I'm shooting the Milky Way, I'm not going to be standing in rain. So it would only be a question of shooting in desert conditions with dust, or if it's a lens that I'm also taking to the beach. But generally speaking, I'd feel pretty happy with all these lenses, which really kind of comes down to 2 questions for me then, besides the price, but I'm just looking for the best quality. And that is, how does it perform in terms of focus, and what's the overall optical quality? In terms of focusing, I could say that they're all pretty close. There's the 2 autofocus lenses. The Sigma lens, being an f1.8 lens, has more low light gathering capability, so it will allow a little bit easier focusing in lower light, shallower depth of field, a little bit more precise, but that and the Nikon, both excellent autofocus lenses. We'll see when the night sky comes out exactly how much additional performance you might expect for manually focusing the Sigma at night, because other than a blue hour shot that I'll take here in a few minutes, the night sky is going to be manual focus. You cannot autofocus on stars, so they're all going to ultimately be manual focus lenses when it comes to the stars here. With the 2 manual focus lenses, they're both very precise. They both have over travel towards infinity. That's one of the things you'll hear about the Zeiss. Some people will claim that it has sort of an infinity lock. You can rotate the lens to infinity and have a sharp focus on infinity. That's not true. In fact, it's right in the Zeiss manual. Every lens has a slightly different flange difference, or sorry, every camera body. So even if you calibrated it to one camera, another camera would perform slightly differently. So there's no single distance there that they'd be able to lock down on the lens and tell you that's exactly infinity. And it's also temperature sensitive. So if I go shoot in snow conditions or I shoot in the hot desert, the infinity point changes a little bit on these lenses. So that is a bit of a false rumor about locking down the Zeiss. And I can confirm on this camera that, in fact, when you lock it all the way to infinity, the Zeiss is not sharp for distant trees or other objects at infinity. But I can say that it's pretty darn close. The amount of over travel is limited, and that is helpful for shooting the night sky, because when you're trying to focus on stars, until you get very close to in focus, they're almost invisible on the LCD. When they get too out of focus, you just can't see them. So the ability to rack to infinity on the lens, even if you're over traveled, it's going to get you close enough on that Zeiss lens that it's going to let you quickly manually focus. So I think there's an advantage there, but it's not the one that some people might think. So focusing between these, fairly comparable. We'll see how the Sigma may have some benefits at the f1.8 versus f2.8. That's 1 1/3 stop advantage in light gathering, so that should be helpful. And then in terms of optical quality, we'll do a head-to-head to compare those at the end and see how they do. Does anyone beat the Nikon in overall image quality? I'll be very excited if one does, and hopefully may be adding another lens to my camera bag. So I'm going to quick shoot the blue hour here to get the foreground, even though I have enough distance between the camera and the foreground that at f2.8 I should be able to shoot hyperfocal and get foreground and the distance. I want to shoot at blue hour here and get full depth of field. It'll just be that much crisper stop down. So it has some benefits doing that, even though I don't quite need it in these conditions. And then when things darken down in about 2 hours, we'll start shooting the Milky Way, and I'll jump to that point where you can look right through the lens of the camera and see what I'm seeing.
So I'm obviously not out in the field anymore. I did capture all the stills and video I needed on location. Unfortunately, I lost a bit of the audio, and so we're gonna re-record things here. But there's a good reason for it, at least a few entertaining reasons, and that is I was all set up in that location. I had this vision of the stars coming out and reflecting off of this creek behind me. It was beautiful, and I definitely got some shots of that. But by the time the sky got dark enough for the stars, it also got cold enough that that creek began to give off a bit of fog. Not enough that I couldn't take the picture, but enough that I didn't think it made the comparisons very apples to apples between the lenses as the fog sort of drifted in and out. So I packed things up. I drove to a second location about 45 minutes away. I was really excited, got out, got the camera all set up, and then as I was about to start shooting, I heard this rustling of leaves behind me, and I looked over my shoulder, and 20 feet away from me were these two little eyes staring back. It was a wolf looking me right in the face. So, you know, I had some bear spray with me, but I thought it was a better idea to just get out of there. So I grabbed my gear, jumped in the car, and drove to a third location. Got some more images, but by the time I set up at that third location, about 1 in the morning, I really just made a mistake and lost some of the audio. So that's why we're recording the rest of this video at home. But let's jump into and show you the live view images off of the back of the camera, the LCD, this is where the focusing happens with these lenses. Here's the live view of the Zeiss. I'm moving over. I've got the lens locked out at the infinity, so it will not rotate any further. And as you can see, the lens is doing a really good job of getting very close to infinity. It wasn't perfect, but I could definitely see that star. And now I'm just kind of rotating the barrel a bit, just looking at, you know, different focal lengths. But obviously, right at infinity is where the star shows pretty darn sharp. So one thing I love about the Zeiss is that infinity lock, even though it's not going to give you actual infinity by turning to it, it's going to get you so close that it's very easy to manually focus at night versus what I'm used to on the Nikon, where you can go so far past infinity, you don't even know where a bright star is to zoom in and focus. So I love that about the Zeiss. Now we're looking at the Sigma, and it is also all the way at infinity, and notice that the star is not nearly as crisp at its infinity endpoint, but it's enough to see it, so it is helpful. You have to zoom in a little bit more on the Sigma, you may have to do a little more searching, but it's pretty quick, and as you can see, you get a nice crisp star, because at f1.8, things are bright, and it's just more clear. I found this lens visibly to be the easiest to find manual focus. And now we're onto the Rokinon with its f2.4 aperture. It's a little bit brighter, but not nearly as bright as the Sigma. And with its infinity lock, more like the Sigma, you get close enough to find stars so you can manually focus them. So all three of these lenses are easy to initially find the stars, unlike the Nikon. And with this lens having a very smooth focus ring and the f2.4 aperture, I find it very easy to manually focus the Rokinon. So all three of these have been great. I would give the edge to the Sigma. Now let's take a look at the Nikon. So here we have the Nikon, which I think has a couple of challenges. One, there is nothing close to an infinity endpoint on this lens. You can go so far past infinity that we just cannot see the star there. You can see I'm starting to find it, but trying to find that star, it can be an exercise in frustration. You really need to shine a light on your lens barrel, get close to the infinity point, and then start doing the sort of tweaking I'm doing here. The second challenge is notice the amount of overshoot that you're seeing as I'm trying to focus the lens here. The challenge is that the ring is a bit sloppy and it's just not as smooth as the Zeiss or the Rokinon manual focus. It's not as crisp or clear as the Sigma. And I really find focus on the Nikon to be difficult. It's not easy to manually focus on stars with any lens, but I truly feel like the Nikon is just a bit of a step behind. And it's not uncommon for me to find some shots after the fact that weren't sharp with the Nikon. I really have to be very careful with the focus on this lens, and occasionally I finish a shot without catching that and I lose the shot. So definitely I would say the Nikon is the worst performer of the bunch in terms of ease of getting close to infinity and then ease of precisely dialing in actual infinity from that point. So let's now take a look at the comparative image quality from these different lenses. All of the images you see here were shot at f2.8. They've been synchronized to have 4,000 Kelvin color temperature and the same plus 12 tint adjustment, but otherwise they are unadjusted RAWs. And all of these are shot at f2.8 so that there are absolutely the same aperture. They have the same ISO and the same 13-second exposure to make them as comparable as possible. Looking at the Zeiss here, we notice a few things about this. The color quality is excellent. I'm happy with the distortion. Vignetting is very heavy. Look at the brightness here near the Milky Way versus the edges. There's substantial fall off, especially in the corners. When we show the adjusted image in a minute, you'll see what that does to the image quality. Next up is the Sigma, which has of course been stopped down from f1.8 to shoot at f2.8, and that has given it a huge advantage. The amount of vignetting in the corners and edges is substantially less. Look at the Zeiss here where it's really falling off. The Milky Way is by far the brightest thing, versus the Sigma, you get much more even lighting across the frame here. And of course, look at how the Zeiss is more zoomed in versus the Sigma, because of course the Sigma goes out to 14 millimeters versus 15 on the Zeiss. So a little wider angle of view, but very, very happy with the big picture here on the Sigma. The color's excellent, the vignetting is excellent, the distortion is minimal on the unadjusted frame here. Next up is the Rokinon, which notice the color shift from the Sigma to the Rokinon is quite apparent. The Milky Way doesn't stand out quite the same, but you can recover that. Vignetting is also pretty significant at the edges, even though it's been stopped down from 2.4 to 2.8. But generally, also a good image. I like all of these so far. And then here's the Nikon for reference. Does a good job with having less vignetting, even though it's shot at its maximum aperture. Also notice here's the Nikon, the Rokinon, and the Sigma. The crop factor is not the same. They're all 14 millimeter lenses, but the Nikon actually gives you a wider field of view, and even after correcting for distortion on these, the Nikon is slightly wider if that's what you're going for. So the big picture on all these images here I think look great. I would definitely give the edge so far to the Sigma with a more even lighting, nice color, and low distortion. Let's take a look now instead at adjusted frames. So I'm going to pull up the virtual copies, and each of these has been adjusted for distortion and vignetting with the partial exception of the Rokinon. The Rokinon does not have an Adobe profile in Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw. So I've done the best I could with vignetting in the manual adjustments in Lightroom, and I've pretty much left the distortion alone. I'm aware that there is a profile for Canon camera version of this lens. I don't know if there's yet a profile available for Nikon users. You can get a third-party profile and use it if it's available. I'm sure that one will be eventually created, and if you know of one now, please mention it in the comments below. And you can, of course, create your own profiles. With other RAW converters, there may already be support, but just be aware if you're thinking of the Rokinon, distortion correction on this lens may not be built into your RAW converter. You may have to do a little additional work to pull it out, and there certainly is some distortion in this lens, so it's a factor to consider. Now, looking at the Zeiss here, with the corners corrected, we get obviously much more even lighting, but notice this purple shift in the edges. Now, these were all shot on the Nikon D810, which tends to have that magenta cast in the deep underexposed shadow. So this lens on the D800 or the D810, I find to be a little disappointing. I would probably not fully correct the vignette on this lens because I don't like the color cast. You could work with this and fix this, but that is something to be aware of with the Zeiss. With the Sigma, it was already so good, you notice the corrected image does not look that different from the original. With the Rokinon, I was able to get much more even lighting across the frame. It's not as heavily vignetted as the Zeiss, so there is a little bit of color shift in the areas that have been corrected on the edges, but it's pretty minimal. So the vignetting on the Zeiss is an issue, whereas on the Rokinon, I don't really think it is an issue. And then on the Nikon, things look great, it corrects very well. So on these adjusted images, things look pretty good. Let's take a closer look at these and we'll just compare them all to the Nikon kind of two at a time. So looking at the Zeiss versus the Nikon, put this into compare mode. And so we've got the Zeiss here on the left versus the Nikon on the right. You can see the image details on the bottom row is kind of telling you the Zeiss versus the zoom lens, which is the Nikon. And let's zoom in here a bit. That's a little too far there. Try that about 1:1. And notice in the corners here, immediately you can see that magenta cast in the Zeiss, but overall the stars are definitely much sharper here. And with the Nikon, you can see on brightest stars like this, you get coma where the stars are not round. You get this little bit of a flare, and that's going to be prominent in the corners, whereas in the Zeiss is almost none of it. You see a little bit here. And let's just look around because these are factors that change throughout different parts of the frame, and so it wouldn't be fair to just look at one part of the image. And of course, we're looking at different stars because the stars had rotated between the time I took these images, but notice the crispness of the Zeiss versus the Nikon, and you might be tempted to think that this is slightly out of focus on the Nikon, and it's indeed possible because it is hard to focus, but I generally find that as I've shot this lens over and over time, this is probably about where this thing should look. It's just not as sharp as a lens like the Zeiss, which is a super premium lens, which is not a zoom lens. So with the Nikon, you're looking at an older lens that's a zoom lens and also shot at its max aperture, like the Zeiss here, which also limits things. So look at some of these other stars on the edge here. The Nikon is just showing some coma, and I am not in love with the overall look of it. And then looking at things like the Milky Way, the galactic center, is just more crisp and colorful and lively. So even though when we zoomed out on the Nikon, the color looked great, as we zoom in, I think the details on the Zeiss win, and I would certainly give the image quality edge here to the Zeiss over the Nikon zoomed in. Let's take a look now at the Sigma versus the Nikon. So we got Sigma on the left and we got the Nikon on the right. Again, this is shot at f2.8, so they're using the exact same shutter, aperture, and ISO. And just like the Zeiss, much sharper image here on the Sigma. I do not see hardly any coma versus the Nikon. You know, things like these flared stars here, just really not much of an issue on the Sigma, at least at f2.8. I'll show you f1.8 in a moment, and that is a different story. But when you push these lenses out to comparable levels, then it is just night and day difference to me. I think the Sigma is much better than the Nikon. I love the Nikon, and you can use it for very large prints, but if you want the best quality, I really have to give the edge here in astrophotography to the Sigma. Let's now take a look at the Rokinon. And again, the Rokinon's been stopped down to f2.8. Not seeing any real issues with coma. As we look around at the details here, it's just generally more of a sharp lens. And again, we're looking at a prime lens versus an older zoom lens. So all three of these lenses, I think, beat the Nikon in terms of image quality when it comes to the specific details. When you get in close and you're looking at the stars, I think they're all a bit sharper. They have less coma. I would shoot with any of these lenses, and I still love my Nikon, but clearly some strong preferences start to show when you look at this level of detail. Now that we've compared everyone at f2.8, let's take off the restriction that we make things comparable and see what we can do if we really push the Sigma and the Rokinon to their absolute maximum apertures. So on the Sigma, we can get all the way out to f1.8, which is what was shot on the left, versus 2.8 on the right. Now, rather than change the shutter speed on these and cause star trail issues or blurring of the stars, what I've done is change the ISO. So we should expect a reduction in noise in the image on the left-hand side, and that's of course one of the benefits of shooting with a wider aperture, is that ability to either use a faster shutter or get lower noise through a lower ISO. At this zoomed out view, we can see that there is definitely some more level of vignetting at f1.8 than we get at 2.8. But I can say that it's definitely very controlled, and when you adjust it, is perfectly fine. Zooming into the details, though, I think is a bit of a different story. Looking at these stars here, notice the star pattern, these 4th and 5th stars on the left versus on the right here. There is a huge difference in quality. We've got a lot of coma in these stars here. If we zoom in yet another level, take a look at these stars here on the left. That coma, I think, is actually pretty bad at f1.8 on the Sigma. It's even a little bit worse than the Nikon at f2.8. And you know, at f1.8, you're asking a lot of the lens, so it's not surprising. But if I'm going to go out and shoot the Milky Way and I really want stars, I would not shoot the Sigma at f1.8. I would definitely stop it down towards f2.8. And the reduction in noise is nice, but notice the star detail on the right. Even though there's less noise on the left, we can see more stars at f2.8. So I just generally think the image quality at f2.8 is a serious step up over the f1.8 on the Sigma. I would use it absolutely for stars. If I was shooting the Aurora, however, it would be a different story. And in that case, I'm not as worried about sharp stars. I want a crisp Aurora, and I need a faster shutter time. You have to shoot at some pretty fast shutter speeds with the Aurora. So I do like having the ability to shoot at f1.8 on the Sigma for that reason. It would be awesome for the Aurora. But for the Milky Way in general, stick with f2.8. You're still getting the benefit, however, of an easier time focusing this lens and just the overall image quality. But in general, I probably wouldn't shoot at f1.8 too often on this lens. And so now let's take a look at the Rokinon. Head-to-head here, we've got the f2.4 version, the maximum aperture on the left, the 2.8 on the right. There is, of course, more vignetting, but more perplexing for me is that the image is actually darker. I've adjusted the ISO the same amount, roughly. The ISO moves in 1/3 on the camera versus the 1/2 on the lens, but it is quite dark. So I really can't account for some of that difference. There almost seems to be less transmitted light here. So I'm not sure exactly what is going on there. But overall, the macro view is fairly comparable. As we zoom in, I think that the stars look nice and crisp in both versions. We've only moved half a stop, but we're not seeing the introduction of coma like we did with the larger jump on the Sigma. So looking across the frame here, I generally find that the f2.4 version on the Rokinon is quite usable. I wouldn't have any hesitation in using it, but for similar reasons, I would probably still shoot at f2.8 on this lens unless I was going to shoot something like the Aurora and wanted that speed advantage. So now that we've waded through all the different details, how does the big picture stack up? Which of these lenses should you choose? What's the best lens? Well, first of all, the Nikon 14-24, I still love this lens. It did not perform as well in image quality as the other lenses, but it still performs well. That is to say, All 4 of these lenses are great, and I would have no problems going out in the field and shooting a professional image for large enlargements. But the Nikon just isn't the same caliber as the other lenses. The other lenses take things a step further, which you would expect with lenses that are newer designs. They're prime lenses, not zoom lenses. And so they can just push things a little bit further. But if you want versatility, I think the Nikon is the best choice for Nikon shooters in the sense that one lens can do 14 to 24. With the other lenses, you're going to have to think about how you cover that other range with an additional lens or just skipping that range. So I certainly still have a place in my camera bag for the Nikon. Next up is the Sigma. I love this lens so much. I went out and bought my own copy of it. It's just an awesome lens. Hands down, I thought it offered the best image quality of the 4. Distortion was excellent. Chroma at f2.8 was excellent. Vignetting was excellent. Color was excellent. It's just a great lens. I'm really excited to throw it on the Nikon D850 and start shooting night skies. With that lower noise level of the D850 and the wide aperture on this, it should be very easy to focus this lens. I know the image quality is going to be excellent, and I've got the additional flexibility for shooting the Aurora. The only thing I'd say about this in terms of downsides, I am not at all a fan of the weight of this lens. It is a chunky lens. Not that much heavier necessarily than the Nikon, but considering that I'm probably going to carry an additional lens to cover up for its inability to shoot at 24 millimeters, it really does add some considerable weight to my bag. So that's something to think about with this lens, whether or not that's a fit for you. Next up is the Rokinon, which goes to the opposite end. It was the lightest lens of the bunch by quite a bit. I really like that aspect of the Rokinon. If I was doing a lot of backpacking and I wanted to keep the weight down, I would think about the Rokinon. The image quality is almost as good as the Zeiss, almost as good as the Sigma in many regards. It's better than the Nikon. So the image quality is certainly there, but in much lighter weight, and then also much lower cost. If you're a Canon shooter, it's about half the cost of the Sigma. Nikon shooters don't save quite as much because the Rokinon Nikon version costs more than the Canon version, but it is going to save you some money. So that's another factor. So if you really want to cut down on the weight or the cost, I would go with the Rokinon. It is just a great lens. I was very pleasantly surprised with the performance of that lens. Even though it's not flawless, it really stands its own. And then lastly is the Zeiss. And I thought this lens, for its reputation and price point, was going to just blow me away. And honestly, that wasn't the case. The image quality is excellent. There's no question. I would say it was second best after the Sigma, but for the price point, I just can't see a reason to upgrade to the Zeiss over the Sigma. You're not going to have the f1.8 to shoot the Auroras. You're not going to get the same level of vignetting, and it just doesn't have quite that same capability. On the other hand, you're getting a lens that is weather sealed and maybe a little bit more robust in that regard. So if you're in dusty or wet environments, that may be a reason to consider the Zeiss. And you can also use screw-in filters with it, which none of the other lenses offer, at least natively. So there are some advantages to the Zeiss, but looking at the bigger picture, I can't think of a strong reason to recommend the Zeiss over the other lenses. So I would pick the Nikon summary for the versatility, the Sigma for the best image quality, and the Rokinon if you want to cut down on cost or weight. Hope you enjoyed that, guys. Please leave any comments or questions below. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure that you subscribe and ring the bell on YouTube to be notified when I release new videos in the near future.